Good afternoon, everyone. I am Carly Allison Wabe from BSN 1 Block 3, and I am here to discuss about the taxation in Spanish Philippines and taxation under the Americans. Taxation in Spanish Philippines. The overview of the report includes the taxes imposed by the Spanish government in the Philippines, the revolts around the tribute, and the tax reform of 1884. The report discusses the various types of taxes imposed by the Spanish government on Filipinos, as well as the revolts around these taxes and other forms of Spanish economic abuse. It piqued the interest of the Spanish government, resulting in a tax reform in 1884. The revenue enjoyed by the Spanish government for more than 3 centuries of the Philippine Islands' livelihood. Only the most prominent features of the central or insular revenue system with historical significance. The Real y Supremo Consejo de las Indias, or the Royal and Supreme Council of the Indies, drafted several colonial taxation laws for the Spanish monarch. The tax reform of 1884, as provided by the Royal Decree of March 1884, was implemented in the 19th century. Taxes during the Spanish period was compulsory. All the Spanish colonies in America and the Philippines were required to pay taxes for 2 reasons. First, as recognition of Spain's sovereignty over the colonies, and the second is to defray the expenses of pacification or the act of forcibly suppressing hostility within the colonies, and governance thereafter. Tributo was a general tax paid by Filipinos to Spain totaling 8 reals. Those who had to pay the tributo were 18 to 50-year-old males, the carpenters, bricklayers, blacksmiths, tailors, and shoemakers, town workers, such as those in the road constructions, and those who is public in nature. The Filipinos were required to pay tributo to the colonial government. The tributo was a symbol of the Filipinos' devotion to the King of Spain. Under Spanish rule, indigenous families were required to cultivate not only enough food and crops for their own consumptions, but also large portions that they were forced to hand over to warlords. The Spanish referred to these forced portions as tributes. The grants gave the Spanish warlords absolute control over all Filipinos living within the encomiendas, as well as the right to force them to work up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and collect the resulting tributes, which is 50% of their crops. Some of you may ask, why are 18 to 50-year-old men required to pay the tribute during the Spanish taxation? Men between the ages of 18 and 50 were required to provide for tribute payments in both viceroyalties. Younger or older people, as well as those who could demonstrate illness or disability, were exempt. Sanctorum was a 3 reals per year tax. These were required to cover the cost of Christianization, such as church construction and the purchase of religious materials. Donativo, or Donativo de Zamboanga, was a tax of half a real for the government's military campaign against Muslims. However, in later years, the money raised through Donativo was almost entirely used to fund the Spanish fort in Zamboanga. Caja de Comunidad. Caja de Comunidad was a tax of 1 real collected for the town's incurred expenses in road construction, bridge repair, or public building improvement. Poli y Servicio, or Servicio Personal, is a system of forced labor that developed within the framework of the encomienda system, which was introduced into South American colonies by the conquistadores and the Catholic priests who accompanied them. It was present in almost every Spanish colonial government throughout the world. Poli y Servicio refers to the 40-day forced labor of men aged 16 to 60 who were required to provide personal services to community projects. The fala, or the corruption of the Spanish falta, meaning absence, is a daily fine of 1.5 real, which could be paid to be exempted from polo. There are several revolts against the Spanish authorities' implementation of taxes. First is the Cagayan and Dingras revolts in 1589, Somorais Revolt, Maniagos Revolt, and Malong's Revolt. In 1589, the Cagayan and Dingras revolts against the tribute occurred on the island of Luzon in the present-day provinces of Cagayan and Ilocos Norte. Ilocanos, Ibanags, and other Filipinos rose up in protest of alleged tax collector abuses, including the collection of high taxes. It all started when the natives killed 6 tax collectors who had arrived from Vigan. Governor General Santiago de Vera dispatched Spanish and Filipino colonial troops to appease the insurgents. The insurgents were eventually pardoned and the Philippine tax system was overhauled. Somoroy's Revolt, or also known as the Somoroy Rebellion, was an uprising against the Spaniards led by Juan Ponce Somoroy Awaray on June 1, 1649 in the area now known as Palapag in northern Samar. The rebellion was sparked by the implementation of the Polo y Servicio system in Samar by local Spanish officials. On June 1, 1649, in the town of Palapag in northern Samar, Somoroy and some of his followers rose in arms against the Polo y Servicio, or forced labor system, being implemented in Samar. This is referred to as the Somoroy Revolt. The government in Manila ordered that all natives subject to the Polo not be sent to locations far from their homes to perform their forced labor. However, on the orders of the alcaldes or mayors, the Waray were sent to the Cavite shipyards to do their polo show, which sparks the revolt. The local parish priest of Palapag was assassinated and the revolt spread to Mindanao, Bicol, and the rest of the Visayas, particularly in Cebu, Masbate, Camiguin, Zamboanga, Albay, Camarines, and parts of northern Mindanao like Surigao. In the Samar Mountains, a rebel government was successfully established. The defeat, capture, and execution of Somoroy in June 1650 dealt a significant blow to the revolt. His trusted co-conspirator, David Dula, continued the fight for freedom with greater zeal, but he was wounded, captured, and later executed by the Spaniards in Palapag, northern Samar, along with his 7 key lieutenants several years later. Maniago's Revolt. The Maniago Revolt was a 1660s uprising in Pampanga named after its leader, Francisco Maniago. Because of its relative wealth at that time, Pampanga drew the majority of the attention from Spanish religious orders. They also had to deal with increased tribute, forced labor, and rice exploitation. Malong's Revolt. In the 1660s, Andres Malong was the Maestro de Campo of Binalatongan, now San Carlos City, Pangasinan, as a result of assisting many Spaniards in governing various towns in Pangasinan. He had learned and was trained to use force and cruelty. He hoped to become king of the province, but his plan was put on hold when a war broke out in Pampanga, led by Francisco Maniago. Malong began his campaign in Malongguay, a small barangay, but failed. He led the people of Pangasinan to take up arms against the Spaniards, as he had done in Pampanga. It quickly spread throughout Pangasinan. As a result of his success, he declared himself King of Pangasinan. Andres Malong led the short-lived but devastating Pangasinan Revolt in 1660 to 1661. Malong, a native of Binalatongan, Pangasinan, was the province master of camp and the governor's right-hand man when it came to dealing with the natives. Timawa was his name. According to an Augustinian account, he was extremely intelligent and clever, although it was his responsibility as master of camp to persuade his fellow Pangasinenses of the benefits of having the Spanish overlord. He had other plans. He was sowing the seeds of revolt in the minds of the people, unbeknownst to his Spanish masters. One of the reasons for the people's disillusionment in Pangasinan was mistreatment by Spanish officials in the province regarding Polo y Servicio. It was during the Dutch occupation of the Philippines. 1,000 indigenous people were employed in Pampanga and Bataan to cut timber for shipbuilding. They were drawn from not only these provinces but also Pangasinan, Ilocos, and Cagayan. They had grown agitated after working away from their families for 8 months and not being paid their meager salaries. Unlike other revolts, Malong's revolt targeted only Spanish government officials and not the Spanish priests. Malong directed that people not only attend masses and pray, but also protect churches and convents from harm. The tax reform of 1884, as provided by the Royal Decree on March 6, 1884, was one of the good reforms introduced by Spain in the 19th century. This tax reform contained two important provisions: abolition of the hated tribute and its replacement of cedula tax, and the reduction of the 40-day annual forced labor, or polo, to 15 days. In 1884, the payment of tribute was repealed and replaced by a graduated poll tax or capitation or head tax. This tax was collected by means of a certificate of identification known as cedula personal, which every resident was required to obtain. Cedula personales, or also known as the head tax, was a type of taxation that replaced the tributary system in 1884. This was a piece of paper that served as proof that one was a Spanish colony and a legitimate member of a pueblo. Previously, Filipinos and Chinese were only required to pay tribute, but the law was changed so that all residents of the Philippines were required to pay the cedula. Cedulas were first issued on March 6, 1884, in accordance with the royal decree. All men and women over the age of 18 who lived on the island, including Spaniards, foreigners, and natives, were required to obtain a cedula. The only exceptions were the Chinese, who paid an additional poll tax, the remontados, the infieles, who were not subject to local administrations, and the indigenous people and colonists of the Jolo archipelago and the islands of Balabac and Palawan. Different types of cedula in total. Originally, there were 9 tax classes with rates ranging from 1.50 to 25 pesos, and a 10th gratis for priests, soldiers, and the privileged classes. Significance of the report. Governments levy fees on citizens and businesses to generate revenue, which is then used to meet budgetary demands. This includes financing government and public projects, as well as improving the country's business environment to promote economic growth. Governments would be unable to meet the demands of their societies if taxes were not levied. Taxation is important because governments collect this money and use it to fund social projects. Among these projects are the health. Government contributes to the health sector would be impossible without taxes. Taxes fund healthcare services such as social health care, medical research, social security, and so on. Next is education. Education may be one of the most deserving of tax dollars. Governments place a high value on human capital development, and education is central to this process. Tax revenue is used to fund, furnish, and maintain the public education system. Governance is an essential component in the smooth operation of a country's affairs. Poor governance would have far-reaching consequences for the entire country, taking a heavy toll on economic growth. Good governance ensures that the money collected is used to benefit the citizens of the country. This money is also used to pay public employees, police officers, members of legislatures, the postal service, and others. Indeed, there will be no effective protection of the public interest in the absence of a proper and functioning form of government. Lastly is business. Good infrastructure such as roads, telephones, and electricity is required for business to thrive in the country. This infrastructure is developed by governments or with close government's involvement. When governments collect money from taxes, they invest it in infrastructure development, which stimulates economic activity throughout the country. Reflection of the student. Taxation during the Spanish era was particularly harsh on our fellow Filipinos. It was unfair that they worked hard but did not receive proper treatment for their rights regarding their earnings because the taxes required were greater than what they could save for themselves. Many people find taxation to be a burden, especially if they don't understand it or have failed to comply properly. Paying the correct tax is an obligation of all income earners in the Philippines. Here's the list of references that the student used for this report. Thank you for listening. Now let's proceed to the taxation under the Americans. Overview of the report. The questions that would be answered after this report is: What is the system of taxation imposed in the Philippines during American times? How does the American tax system work in the Philippines? What is the history of taxation in the Philippines and what is taxation? Americans adopted the Spanish taxation system, the urbana, a tax on the annual rental value of an urban real estate, was replaced by the land tax, which charged both urban and rural estate civil government in the Philippines, William Howard Taft and Luke E. Wright. Trivia on the history of taxation in the Philippines. Taxation in the Philippines started with an ancient Filipinos who paid taxes to their datu or chiefs in exchange for the protection they provided. The tax was known as buwis. Except for the datu or the household chieftains, everyone is required to pay taxes. During this time, there was also a penalty for failing to pay taxes. Taxation in the Philippines during the American period. The Americans who acquired the Philippines intend to make it a self-sufficient economy by generating the least amount of revenue and running a budget surplus. From 1898 to 1903, Americans adopted the Spanish taxation system with a few modifications, noting that the taxation introduced by the Spaniards were outdated and regressive. The military government suspended the contracts for the sale of opium, which is a kind of drug classified as antidepressant, lottery, a form of gambling, and the coinage of money. The urbana tax was imposed at a rate of 5% on the net rental value of all houses. Several exemptions were granted. Assessment boards compiled the tax list or padron. The issue with land tax was that titling in rural areas was very disorganized. The appraising of land value was influenced by political and familial factors. The introduction of a taxation system on agricultural land faced an objection from the landed elite. Tax evasion was prevalent, especially among the elites. Civil government in the Philippines under William Howard Taft and Luke E. Wright. On July 2, 1904, the Bureau of Internal Revenue or the BIR was created through the passage of Reorganization Act No. 1189. On August 1, 1904, the BIR was formally organized and made operational. The Internal Revenue Law of 1904 was modeled after the Internal Revenue Law in effect in the United States at the time. It established the foundation for a Bureau of Internal Revenue and primarily levied consumption taxes in the form of specific taxes, stamp and poll taxes, and sale taxes. There are 10 major sources of revenue. First is the license tax on firms dealing in alcoholic beverages and tobacco. Second is excise taxes on alcoholic beverage and tobacco products. Third, taxes on banks and bankers. The fourth is the document stamp taxes. Fifth is the cedula. Sixth is the taxes on insurance and insurance companies. Seventh is the taxes on forest products. 8. Mining concessions. 9. Taxes on business and manufacturing. And lastly, the occupational licenses. Cedula. On January 1, 1940, Commonwealth Act No. 465 went into effect, mandating the imposition of a base residence tax of 50 centavos and an additional tax of 1 peso based on factors such as income and real estate holdings. In 1907, changes in cedula and industrial tax. The cedula under the new law went through changes as the rate was fixed per adult male. Some locations were given permission to double the cedula fee. The industry tax was levied. On October 3, 1913, under Wood and Simmons Tariff Act, the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and the Governor General Francis Burton Harrison. Its goals included lowering taxes on produced and semi-manufactured commodities and doing away with customs on the majority of raw materials. In 1904, the Internal Revenue Act imposed taxes on mines, petroleum products, and dealers of petroleum products and tobacco. There are 3 new sources of tax that were introduced. First is the income tax in 1914, the inheritance tax in 1919, and the national lottery in 1932. Taxation during the Commonwealth period in 1935 to 1945. In 1936, addition of a surface rate, and November 15, 1937, the abolition of cedula tax. The cedula tax was abolished by the National Assembly of the Philippines because of the heavy burden that brings to the poor people. On January 1, 1940, the imposing of residence tax. Every inhabitant of the Philippines over 18 years of age who has been regularly employed on a wage or salary basis and on every corporation, no matter how created or organized, is subject to residence tax. Exemptions are the following: the U.S. High Commissioner and member of his staff, the commissioned officers and enlisted soldiers of the U.S. Army and Navy, the representative and officers of foreign powers, the transient visitors staying less than 3 months in the Philippines. The National Internal Revenue Code of 1939 says that the new tax system during the Commonwealth. Significance of the report. Tax income is how the Philippine government pays for operations and development projects. Tax revenue is a vital component of the nation's economic and fiscal policy because it is the government's source of income. Aside from the revenue that taxes generate, they also help promote economic stability and growth. By imposing taxes on goods and services, the government can discourage unnecessary consumption and production and ensure that resources are used more efficiently. The Philippines uses taxes to redistribute income and wealth in the society. Progressive taxation systems, for instance, tax higher incomes at higher rates to reduce inequality. Similarly, taxes on luxury goods or sin products like tobacco and alcohol help raise revenue while also discouraging their consumption. Here is a list of references that the student used for this report. Thank you for listening.